Watch it happen in real time. A room of 8 people, a decision on the table. Someone speaks, and as they speak, the room is doing 2 things simultaneously. It is processing the content, and it is rendering a verdict. Not about the argument, about the person making it, about what the fact of their speaking, at this length, with this frequency, in this room, reveals about where they believe they sit within it. The verdict is never announced. It does not need to be. It distributes itself through the texture of how people respond or stop responding, through the quality of attention the room extends, through who gets interrupted and who does not, through whose silence, when it finally arrives, the other people in the room wait out, and whose silence nobody notices at all. The man being categorized in real time almost never knows it is happening. He is focused on the content. He is making his argument. He is demonstrating something he genuinely has: competence, preparation, analytical depth, and he cannot understand why the room does not reorganize itself around him the way he expected it to. What he does not understand is this: the room is not listening to what he is saying. Not primarily. It is listening to what the pattern of his saying it reveals about his judgment, about the specific and fundamental capacity to distinguish what matters from what does not. And that capacity, the discrimination between what is worth externalizing and what is worth keeping, is the primary currency of authority in every room that actually matters. This is not a video about speaking less. It is a video about what your speech is continuously communicating about your judgment, and why, in rooms where judgment is the coin of the realm, verbal excess is not a style problem. It is a credibility problem. There is a specific scene that plays out in organizations at every level, with a consistency that suggests it is not an individual failure, but a structural one. A senior creative pitch. 6 people around a table, presenting to 2. The presenting team has done the work. The strategy is sound. The numbers are defensible. The recommendation is genuinely good. One person on the team leads most of the presentation. Another adds context after each section. A third fills the silences with elaboration. A fourth, who has said almost nothing for 40 minutes, asks a single question near the end that reframes the entire conversation, that names the actual tension the proposal had been circling without addressing, in 11 words. The 2 people being pitched leave the room and talk about the 4th person. Not because the question was more impressive than the work, because the question demonstrated something the work could not demonstrate on its own, a mind operating at the level of the room's architecture rather than its surface. A mind that had been processing everything, selecting ruthlessly, and producing only the one output that altered the direction of the conversation. A mind, in other words, that could tell the difference. That capacity, discrimination, is what verbal excess systematically destroys. Not because talking too much is rude, or because silence is inherently sophisticated, but because every unnecessary contribution is a data point, and the accumulation of data points forms a model. The model is not about your intelligence. It is about your judgment, about whether you can be trusted to know, without external guidance, what is worth saying and what is not. The man who comments on every agenda item, who adds a clarification after every colleague's point, who preemptively explains his reasoning before anyone has questioned it. That man has communicated something very specific and very damaging. He cannot make that distinction. Everything gets the same treatment. Every thought receives immediate externalization. There is no interior editing process the room can trust, because the room has never seen evidence that one exists. What most capable people never examine is the assumption driving this pattern. The assumption is that demonstrating your thinking is equivalent to demonstrating your value, that the room rewards visibility of process. This assumption has roots in school, where raising your hand was the proxy for engagement, in early career environments, where output volume signaled effort, In those systems, the assumption was approximately correct. In rooms where actual authority is assigned and contested, it is precisely backwards. The rooms that matter do not reward the visibility of your thinking. They reward the quality of your conclusions. And conclusions, by definition, are what survives the editing process, the part that remains after everything that was not worth saying has been withheld. The man whose editing process is invisible, whose contributions arrive already filtered, already stripped of everything non-essential, is the man whose contributions the room treats as events rather than noise. The man whose editing process is the meeting itself has told the room something he cannot take back. Machiavelli was not primarily interested in communication as a subject. He was interested in the durability of authority, in why some structures of power survived pressure and others collapsed at the first serious test. But embedded in his analysis of princes and councils is an observation about speech that has no equivalent anywhere else in the political literature of his era. He observed that the prince who thinks out loud, who allows his reasoning process to become visible in council, who shares the formation of his judgment in real time rather than its conclusions, commits an error that no subsequent display of intelligence can correct. Not because the reasoning is weak, because the act of revealing it has transferred something from the prince to the room, the ability to manage him. If the council knows how the prince thinks through problems, what information moves him, what sequence of argument he responds to, what objections he cannot easily dismiss, they know something more valuable than any single piece of intelligence. They know the architecture of his decision-making. And the person whose decision-making architecture is fully legible to the people around him has ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be making decisions. He is being managed toward conclusions others have already determined, through the precise calibration of what they choose to present and how. Machiavelli's word for what this destroys is gravitas. Weight. The quality that causes others to approach your judgment as something unknown, something that must be waited for because it cannot be anticipated. A prince without gravitas is not a prince who is liked less. He is a prince whose decisions the room has already accounted for before they arrive, whose authority has been, through transparency, made fungible. Robert Greene mapped this same mechanism across a much wider historical record and arrived at a different entry point to the same principle. What he documented was not the loss of inscrutability in council. It was the loss of projected significance in social hierarchies at every level. His observation, drawn from courts, creative industries, and organizational structures across 5 centuries, was this: when a person is fully known, when everything they think is immediately visible, when they engage with everything, when no observer ever has to wonder what they are thinking because they are always in the process of broadcasting it, that person loses something the observer has actually been providing. The observer, facing insufficient information about a person, does not conclude that there is nothing to know. They fill the gap. They project depth, significance, and authority into the space that has not been filled with explicit information. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a feature, and it is the mechanism that silence activates and verbal excess destroys. The person who says less than they know does not merely appear more strategic. They appear more significant because the observer's mind, doing what minds do, has populated the unexplained portion of them with something more impressive than any explanation would have been. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the outsourcing of it to the imagination of everyone in the room. There is a specific verbal act that most frameworks on this subject ignore entirely, and it is the one that most precisely separates the person who fills rooms from the person who commands them. Not the fewer words, not the deliberate pause, not the restrained response. The question. The question is the highest status verbal move available in any high-stakes conversation, and almost no one who is thinking about communicative authority treats it that way. They think of questions as concessions, as admissions of incomplete information, as conversational deference to whoever is being asked. They treat asking as the subordinate move and asserting as the dominant one. They are wrong, and the error costs them the most powerful instrument in the room. Consider what a well-constructed question actually does. It does not add to the conversation. It operates on it. It reveals the structure beneath the surface, the assumption everyone was making without examining, the tension the discussion had been circling without naming, the dimension that all the assertions had been unable to reach because they were operating on the same level as the problem rather than above it. A question that does this does not demonstrate that you have information. It demonstrates that your intelligence has been processing the entire conversation at a level of abstraction that nobody else in the room was working at. That demonstration is categorically more powerful than any answer you could have given. An answer shows the room what you know. A question shows the room how you think. And in every hierarchy where authority is contested and assigned, how you think is the variable that ultimately determines where you land. The practical architecture of this is specific. The question that commands a room is never the clarifying question. The one that asks for more information about what was just said, which signals that you were not quite keeping up. It is not the rhetorical question deployed as a disguised assertion, which the room reads immediately as assertion and processes accordingly. It is the question that reframes. That introduces a dimension nobody had named. That makes the conversation go somewhere it was not going before you asked it. And that makes everyone in the room immediately aware of where it was going without you. That kind of question cannot be generated reactively. It is the product of an interior process that has been running in parallel with the visible conversation, a process that only has the processing power to operate that way because it has not been depleted by continuous output. The man who has been talking for 40 minutes does not have the cognitive or social resources to generate that question. He has spent them. The man who has been listening has been compounding them. This is the most practical dimension of what verbal restraint actually produces, not just the social signal of selectivity, not just the projected authority of silence, the actual substantive capacity to generate the intervention that changes a room. The silence was not performance, it was preparation. The recalibration this requires begins not with behavior, but with the internal question you bring to every conversation. Most people operate below the level of conscious awareness on a version of the same question. What can I contribute here? The question sounds constructive. It is, in practice, a permission structure for unlimited output, because the answer is almost always something. And the person asking it will find that something and externalize it, regardless of whether its externalization serves any purpose beyond their own need to have contributed. The question that produces a different behavioral pattern from the inside is harder and more honest. What would be lost if I said nothing here? Asked with genuine rigor, the answer is frequently nothing of consequence. The decision would be reached, the conversation would arrive at its destination, and you would have preserved, for the moment of genuine leverage, another unit of the attention reserve your restraint has been quietly building. That reserve is real. It is not metaphorical. The room you have not dominated verbally today has formed a different model of you than the room you have. The model is incomplete. And incompleteness, as the Machiavellian framework makes clear, is an asset rather than a liability. The people who will make decisions about your authority, your access, your standing, are working from that model. And a model with gaps is a model that assigns you more room than you have explicitly claimed. The second dimension concerns what happens in the moments when you do choose to speak. Having established a pattern of restraint, having conditioned the room to treat your contributions as selective rather than reflexive, you have created an obligation. The contribution must bear the weight of the attention it is about to receive. This means completing the thought internally before externalizing it. Not the way you were trained to communicate, packaging a thought clearly once you have decided to share it, but at a more fundamental level, deciding whether the thought is worth the expenditure at all, and if so, delivering the version that has been filtered rather than the version that arrived first. The version that arrived first is almost never the right one. It is the raw material, the contribution that lands with genuine weight in a room, the one that people reference later, the one that appears in the summary of what was decided and why, is almost always the version that was held for an additional 30 seconds of interior editing before it was released. Third, your non-responses are communications. This is the dimension most people miss entirely, because they are focused on what they are saying rather than what their pattern of responses is continuously broadcasting. When you do not react to a provocation, the room does not read silence as absence. It reads it as self-governance, as evidence that your responses are governed by your own evaluation rather than by the management of other people's expectations of you. When you allow an argument you disagree with to stand for a moment before responding, the response that arrives carries a different authority than the reflexive rebuttal. Because the room has witnessed the choice. They have seen that you could have responded immediately. The decision not to was deliberate, and deliberateness in social systems is one of the most consistent signals of internal authority. The final dimension is the one that separates execution of this framework from permanent transformation by it. Most people who encounter these principles attempt to implement them as tactics, as deliberate behavioral modifications that they apply from the outside while the underlying orientation remains unchanged. This approach fails because the room, which is more socially calibrated than most people give it credit for, can feel the difference between restraint that is genuine and restraint that is performed. Performed restraint has a specific texture, a slight stiffness, a quality of effort, an occasional overcorrection when the discipline slips. Genuine restraint is invisible because it is not restraint at all. It is the natural consequence of a person who has genuinely internalized that what they are protecting, the reserve of assigned authority that selective speech builds, is worth more than whatever they are withholding. That internalization requires a confrontation with what is actually driving the compulsion to speak. For most capable men, it is a specific anxiety, the fear that a position not continuously articulated will be forgotten, that silence is invisibility, that the space not verbally occupied will be taken by someone else. This fear is not irrational. In certain contexts, at certain moments, it is accurate. But the response it generates, continuous verbal occupation of space, solves the wrong problem. It addresses the fear of invisibility by making you always visible. What it cannot produce is the thing that actually matters, the quality of visibility that makes your presence in a room something the room registers differently from everyone else's. That quality is not built by what you say. It is built by what the room has learned to expect from you, which is a function of everything you have not said, accumulated across time, until the pattern itself has become the message. There is a question worth sitting with when the room clears. Not what you said, not whether the argument landed, whether the room, when it replays the conversation internally, as rooms always do, in the hours and days after a decision was made, whether your contribution is the one that changed the geometry of the discussion, the one that arrived and made the conversation go somewhere it was not going before. That contribution almost never comes from the person who spoke the most. It comes from the person whose silence had conditioned the room to wait for them, whose restraint, sustained long enough to become a pattern, had created the expectation that when they finally spoke, it would be worth attending to. Machiavelli's deepest insight about authority was not about force or cunning or ruthlessness. It was about the architecture of what others are permitted to know about you. The prince who controlled that architecture controlled the terms on which he was engaged, not through deception, through the deliberate management of what was revealed and the strategic preservation of what was not. Every room you enter is an architecture decision. Every time you speak, you are choosing what to make visible. Every time you do not, you are protecting something that no single contribution could ever produce. The authority of a mind that the room cannot fully account for, and therefore cannot fully discount. The most powerful voice in any room is rarely the loudest one. It is the one the room has learned to wait for. Build the silence first, then speak from it.